In a previous lesson, we learned about an amazing story that science presents to us. That 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was a lifeless rock. Today, of course, it's a rock with life. Now, that's an amazing transition, although it did take a long time. Now, when we inspect the living things on planet Earth, we find that all living things are composed of cells, or they are single-celled organisms. Now, what can we conclude from this fact? Modern biologists make the inference that if all living things are made of cells, that's because the first living thing was a cell. So at some time in the distant past, out of the lifeless, rocky Earth emerged the first living thing, and it was a cell. Now, being a living thing, a cell is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. And that means that this little cell had a tremendous future in store. Now, the famous biologist Charles Darwin invites us to think of all living things on the planet as being related in a tree of life. And here's how he imagines this. All living species are on the tips of the branches. So we can see a sort of a tree here. And all living things would take their place on the tips of the branches of the tree. Each species would have its own little branch tip, including the single-cell organisms like amoeba and paramecia and all the different kinds of bacteria. So every species alive today is taking its place on the tips of the branches. Now, if you look at a tree, you'll easily see that the branches converge as we move down the tree towards the trunk. So as we move down the tree, these two branches right here will converge at some point. The human and the fish will converge at some point. The tree and the algae will converge at some point. And Darwin imagines that as we move down the tree, we're moving back in time. So as we go down the tree towards the trunk, we're traveling back in time. This means that any two species on the tree that exist today had a common ancestor at some point in the past. So for the butterfly and the fish, it would be here. For the butterfly and the tree, it would be down here. So any two species on Earth are related by common ancestry. And if we take this all the way down to the root of the tree, then we arrive at the last universal common ancestor. Now, because cells can reproduce with heredity, and sometimes mutations introduce new traits, the first cells could evolve into ever more complex life forms. Living organisms, therefore, could change over time. So this is an incredible story. From a simple cell, all living things on Earth evolved. And this is the modern view of the history of life. Now, what were the first cells like? Well, the first cells likely had the universal features of cells, because after all, that would explain why all cells have certain features, because they got it from the first cell that emerged on Earth. Well, what are these features? Well, cells have a membrane that keeps everything together and regulates the flow of materials in and out. Cells have a fluid interior. The cytoplasm fills the interior where proteins perform the chemistry of life. So proteins are going to extract energy from food molecules, and the proteins are going to build important molecules in the cell. That's the chemistry of life. And then DNA stores the information to make the cell's proteins. So there must be some information to make the workers of the cell. So these would be the basics of all living cells. Now here we see a picture of two kinds of bacteria here. And scientists infer that the first cells on Earth would have been something like bacteria. Now, why bacteria? Well, bacteria are the smallest and simplest cells on Earth. They don't have a nucleus, no mitochondria. And the first cells to emerge on Earth would likely be simple cells. Bacteria show the most diverse biochemistry, as though they had been around for a long time, evolving new biochemical adaptations for a variety of environments. And bacteria can live in extreme environments, which is consistent with their ancestors evolving in extreme environments on the early Earth. Let's not forget the early Earth would have been an extreme environment. Some bacteria today can live in extreme environments, and so this gives scientists confidence that bacteria may have been able to emerge in these extreme environments. Now here in this picture we see the two major different kinds of cells on Earth. We have complex cells like amoeba and paramecia. Both have a nucleus and they have mitochondria. But then we have these tiny rod-like cells. These are bacteria. They are the smallest and simplest types of cells on Earth. If we use another analogy, paramecia and amoeba are like ocean liners, whereas bacteria are like little motorboats. Now in this slide here, it would be a drop of water from a pond, right? So the amoeba crawls around and the paramecium swims around, and the bacteria are thriving as well. So a huge size difference we see in this picture. And here we say amoeba here and stentor and paramecia. In a world teeming with bacteria, complex cells are giants indeed. So these are really large cells. In this picture, we see an amoeba has eaten a stentor and several paramecia. In fact, we see smaller species of amoeba here and here and here and here. Again, we see an amoeba here eating a paramecium, but in the corner down here, we have a mass of bacteria cells. And here again, we see a food vacuole. Amoeba has eaten a paramecium. And over here, little rod-like cells of bacteria, little bacteria here and there on the cover slip of the slide. So we've seen then that the origin of life consisted of the emergence of the first kind of cell, and it would have been a simple bacteria-like cell. But all the other familiar life forms that we know about are composed of complex cells. All the multi-celled organisms, the cells that make up those organisms, have a nucleus and mitochondria, and so do amoeba and paramecia, euglena. So these are all single-celled organisms, but the cell is a complex cell. So we've got the origin of life involving a bacteria-like cell, but then we've got all these other life forms being constructed out of complex cells. So clearly, at some point in the past, there was some kind of major evolutionary innovation going from a simple type of cell to a more complex type of cell. Now, if we think about organisms with complex cells, or just complex cells in general, we also find shared traits of complex cells. So there are certain characteristics that are shared among complex cells. One is their large size. They're 10,000 times bigger than bacteria by volume. They have a nucleus. They've got cytoskeletal proteins, like the microtubules that control cell shape that we learned about with amoeba. They have movement or force-generating proteins, like myosin pulling on actin. And they have mitochondria. And you'll recall that mitochondria produces large quantities of energy for the cell. We've seen this picture before. So here we have the cell membrane. And two of the main features of complex cells, a nucleus, so a nuclear membrane surrounding DNA, and mitochondria. Now, because all complex cells have these shared traits, biologists make certain inferences from that fact. So when species share a trait, biologists since Darwin consider the possibility that they inherited the shared trait from a common ancestor in the past. According to evolutionary theory, then, animals, plants, fungi, and all single-celled organisms, besides bacteria, had a common ancestor that was the first complex cell. This ancestor cell had all of the characteristics on the previous slide and evolved into all life forms more complex than bacteria. So here we go. The idea is the reason why all of these species are composed of complex cells is because they can trace their ancestry back to the first complex cell. That was the common ancestor to all organisms higher up on the tree. Now, where did that complex cell come from? Well, its ancestors were bacteria. So we have to tell a story about the origin of the first complex cells.